For Louisiana versus all y'all, Jarrett Rose with Roy Lang of the Shreveport Bossier Advocate, checking back in after a few weeks of football where there have been tons of storylines unfolding early on in this season around the state. And it feels like a lot of the big ones are up in the Shreveport area. Certainly some notable developments for some teams that we look at among the top in their respective classes. And so, Roy, glad you had a couple minutes and we could connect and kind of catch up on how some of these teams are doing.
Man, I get a text from you, and it's always a yes. I appreciate all the hard work you do, and I love contributing in any way I can.
I appreciate you, man, for sure. The season preview stuff and now getting a chance to catch up a little bit. And I mentioned there's a lot to get to in terms of Shreveport early on this season. And so let's start with it and talk about one that I know caught a lot of eyes around the state this week with Calvary Baptist, the number one ranked team in Class 2A going into the season. A lot of expectations of their ability to compete at a high level, regardless of classification. They lost a week ago to Neville in a great game that a lot of folks were watching, but Neville is a 5A team that everyone kind of knew to expect. This week, they lose to a really good Franklin Parish team in 4A that I don't know that people were as aware of the quality of that team under Coach Burnett and company, but back-to-back losses and a loss to a team that, again, was not as much on folks' radar around the state as Neville was. What's kind of your reaction to seeing the Cavs drop two straight and just kind of where they are at this point in the season?
It's surprising in one end because of what they did last year, but to quote Coach Guin, this team ain't last year's team. Every team is different, but Franklin Parish, I think certainly, as you mentioned, a lot of people might have, and I certainly, when I was making my predictions, underestimated them. And it wasn't so much that Calvary lost, the way they lost. I mean, they were down, 32-7, I believe, at one point. Wardell throws a pick six on the first drive. James Simon fumbles 2 plays later. It's 14-0 before you can even breathe. But I want to go back to week 1 against Oak Grove. Following the win, big win, 62-41, I think, at home against Oak Grove. Another great team, defending state champ. Rodney Guin was so mad. He wasn't congratulatory. He was ripping his team for 5 minutes. Pants aren't hung up in the locker. Not wearing the right T-shirt underneath their uniforms, this and that. He said, guys, this last year, that team knew how to win. They expected to win, but they knew how to win, not just on the football field, off the field. He said, this is going to come bite you guys. The Neville game was a great game. No shame in losing that whatsoever. But I think all this stuff came to bite them in week 3. And he said, we didn't show up. He said, we didn't coach him good enough. He took the blame, whereas his stars really, didn't perform well, which we just haven't seen. He could have thrown them under the bus, but he was like, we didn't coach him good enough. They had no energy. This was a big game, and we're down 32-7. And it goes back, it reflects back on what he was saying in week 1. Hey, just because we won 14 games last year, it doesn't mean it's going to happen this year. You guys got to do all the stuff right. And maybe this is the wake-up call that they needed.
I think kind of quietly the coaching staff certainly hopes it is, but thinks that this might be good for this team over the long haul for all of those reasons you just mentioned. And I'll say I'm the guy that still has them as my number 1 team in the Class 2A polls, despite the back-to-back losses, because I think they are still the favorite to beat in that classification. But obviously, where they are right now is a little bit of a surprise to a lot of people, and probably the biggest surprise of all to some of the kids in that locker room. And I guess we'll see how they handle it early on and grow from it.
No doubt. And those polls are so funny. People look and you'll see a lot of teams with 1 win, and there's a team with no wins in the top 10 in some of these polls. And people are like, you guys are nuts. And it's like, listen, as bad as the last 2 weeks were for Calvary, it affects nothing in terms of their state championship run. It affects nothing in terms of the district, certainly. But, last year was not a surprise that they won a state championship, at least to me, because I saw what they did against 5A teams and 4A teams, some really good 5A and 4A teams. So the blueprint was there. This year, not saying they can't win a state championship, but it might be a little more surprising just considering how they fared against some of these same type of teams. So it doesn't affect their run at a state championship, but they got to figure this out. I mean, they got to figure it out. That kind of stuff, going back to the off the field stuff. I mean, when you're at the Superdome and you're worried about, who's hanging their pants up right, or if you got the right color t-shirt on underneath your uniform, that doesn't lead to victories in big games like that. So, they're back in district. Darbon Woods, another undefeated team, by the way, comes to Calvary. If they're shaky this week, then it's time to sound the alarm bells. For right now, they're sort of treading water.
Similar sort of dynamic, North DeSoto, another team that we look at among the top contenders in Class 4A and in that Division II non-select. They're in a tough spot right now, and a little bit tougher of a road for them at this point because of the way they got there. They lose the back-to-back games, and so they're 1-2 as well. But a big part of that storyline is they've had some really key pieces of that team go down with injury. I mean, what's the dynamic right now, and in terms of how the Griffins are handling that, just kind of whether talking to Coach Dunn or having a feel for that program right now to suffer some of the roster losses they've had in terms of injury and how they shake back from some of this?
Cole Corey was certainly the biggest loss in terms of, attention. State's leading receiver from last year. Many people think, not just the numbers, but many people think he is the best receiver in the state. Goes down with a knee injury. Still, it was supposed to be 10 days. So I guess tomorrow was the next visit to the doctor to see whether or not he really could come back in 6 weeks, or he's going to have surgery right now so they can play baseball in the spring. But losing a guy like that is huge. But again, like Calvary, a little different circumstance. This doesn't affect district play. But this week, no better time for the Griffins to get back on the horse than in a game that is probably going to – I'm not trying to demean any other team in District 1 4A, but Northwood travels to Stonewall this week. It's probably going to determine the district winner. It has for the last few years. I don't know why this would be any different. But Luke Delafield, Kenny Thomas, those are two guys that certainly can shoulder the load. But is it enough? I mean, Northwood's really good. They've had a great start. But Dennis Dunn, don't count them out. Dennis Dunn knows how to coach. These kids know how to play. And while it's a big loss, what they want to do is still in front of them.
And spending some time with the 5A district as well. I put on one of the statement wins this week, the Louisiana versus Loyola top 5 statement wins around the state, along with that Franklin Parish Calvary Baptist game. I thought Byrd beating Evangel was huge for a lot of reasons, in terms of Byrd kind of showing they're still there, improving to 3-0. Evangel's now 1-2, despite all the hype around that team. A coach up in y'all's area told me that this was the first 1-5A loss that Evangel had suffered. I mean, going back through their history. And so what was your kind of takeaway from that game, and just where Byrd is and how seriously we need to start taking them this year? And also Evangel, who we knew would potentially be some growing pains early in the season, but just kind of where they are through 3 weeks of this thing.
Yeah, it was Evangel's first home loss ever in District 1 5A, which is, they haven't been in District 1 5A, throughout the glory days, but still the fact that there's still a first loss for Evangel for something is significant. And, the most significant thing for Byrd, they rushed for 400 yards that night. Pop still got his. He got 300, mid 300s, I believe, passing. But Byrd won 4 games last year. They're now 3-0. I don't care who you play, and they've played good teams. But to be in week 4, have a chance to equal your win season, they are certainly locally right now. They're authoring the best turnaround story locally as far as any prep football team. So we'll see how it plays out. The meat of their schedule is still coming up, but they rushed for 400 yards. Their defense harassed Pop, even though he had, over 300 yards passing. And that's been Evangel's issue. I watched that Neville game, and Pop was running for his life. I mean, there wasn't a lot of help up front. And, at any level of football, the winner is usually determined up front on both sides of the ball. So Pop's elusive. He can create plays, but, in the end, you got to have some help up front. And that's been the issue for them. But for Byrd and what Stacy Ballou has done early in the season, I mean, it was – and he will tell you, last year was bad. Like, you would have looked at Byrd and been like, is this the worst Byrd team we've ever seen? And, some people within the Byrd program sort of saw it coming with the middle school programs and stuff like that. But, man, what a turnaround. What a turnaround. And, are they for real? We're going to see, because they play Parkway in a couple of weeks. Byrd's tough to play. Parkway's got a great defense, but Byrd's offense, as you know, is an unusual animal. And can Parkway beat Byrd, or can Byrd beat Parkway? They sort of got run out of the crib last year. So I think that will really tell us a lot about Byrd and Parkway. But for right now, no matter what happens, Byrd's story is really, really good.
Both of those teams you mentioned are sitting at 3-0 right now, and they've obviously got to get through week 4 to potentially still be undefeated when they see each other. I think both should probably be favored in those week 4 games, though, even with Byrd on the long road down to New Orleans to face John Ehret. But that's setting up to be a pretty intriguing week 5 matchup for sure.
Yeah, Airline, Byrd, Parkway, man, Huntington. We get their first trip into back to 1-5A, and they're making some waves. Undefeated 2-0 in district already. Great job by Stephen Dennis. So I was excited about what 1-5A was going to bring this year, because it was 9 teams, the unusual 9-team district. So you have a bye week for somebody every week, and the district starts in week 3. So, I mean, it's really neat. Or week 2, I guess. It started week 2. The district play started week 2 because they have a bye. But, man, I'm even more excited about it now. And, talking about not even the undefeated district team, but Evangel. I mean, this week in Airline, are we going to have a shootout here? I mean, it looks like it. I know Justin Scoggin going to be mad at me for saying it's going to be a shootout, because he always likes to talk about his defense. But his defense, to be honest, the 3 games they've played this year, they have allowed the most point. Their opponent has scored the most points against Airline as they did of any of the other games on their schedule so far. So I'm not 100% convinced that defense is there, but they can outscore everybody. They have some weapons that others don't. But 1-5A, man, it's so much fun right now. There are so many. Last year Captain Shreve sort of stole the thunder, going undefeated for the first time in that district. But now you've got a very, very deep district, and I'm interested to see how this plays out.
And you led right into, I was interested in that Airline team and where they are right now, and particularly that matchup, Airline against Evangel in week 4, where I don't know that the over-under is 100, but they're certainly capable of putting 100 on the board this weekend. The over-under is probably going to be, not too far off from that. The Vikings right now, with back-to-back nearly 30-point wins in those games against Benton and Union Parish, some of the numbers that Ben Taylor and Jarvis Davis and Kenny Darby and all those guys are putting up, just kind of where do you see this Vikings team that we knew going in was going to be one of the best teams, not only in the state, but in the area, and someone that we needed to be watching on a statewide, potentially deep playoff run, type dynamic?
They've been so consistent the last year and a half. For the first time, the Advocate debuted in Shreveport last year. So from the preseason poll until this week, Calvary had been number 1 for very good reason. They were not number 1 this week. Airline takes that top spot. They'd love to have that game against Captain Shreve back last year, but hey, that's football. They scored 50 and lost in the playoffs. Nate Shepard's pretty good, by the way. So, Airline can beat anybody. It really, because they can outscore anybody, but they need some help from their defense. This week is going to be a great test. Airline's I don't want to say considerable. That sounds they're a favorite, and they should be a favorite, and they're a decent favorite this week against Evangel. But can they get the stops? I mean, Pop, like we just talked about, he creates a lot. They can put points on the board, and Airline has allowed a lot of points. So this is going to be a very, very interesting test. Airline's deeper, so I think as the game moves along, we're talking about the front lines. I think they're probably going to wear them down at some point. But I could totally see another game like 56-50 like we saw in the playoffs last. I mean, I could. I mean, does it mean it's going to happen? I don't know, but Airline's ready to score some points. I promise you that. And Evangel, while they gave up a lot of running yards last week, their secondary is going to be tested. Two of the best receivers in this area for sure, and a quarterback who's number 6 all time in city area. What does he have? 9,000 yards, 9,066 or something career yards for Ben Taylor. He can climb to number 2. By the way, he probably won't get to Brock Berlin, but he can get to number 2 all time in Shreveport Bossier. And considering this is where Evangel and Calvary are, they've had some prolific passers. That's a heck of a career for Ben Taylor. But I am very interested to see how that Airline defense, because if Airline plans to make any waves in the postseason, their defense has to be better than it was last year, because it's going to be almost impossible for their offense to be better. I mean, they averaged almost 50 points last year. So their defense has to be better. We'll see this week.
That's just kind of the tip of the iceberg, obviously, of some of the teams that Roy's covering up there in the Shreveport area. Make sure that you're visiting Shreveport Bossier Advocates website and keeping up with all the high school action. And Roy, I appreciate you taking 15 or 20 minutes to talk about some of those big notable points for folks around the state to keep an eye on.
Man, my phone line is always open for you, buddy. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. Appreciate you, man. Again, he's Roy Lang, Shreveport Bossier Advocate. I'm Jared Rosa for Louisiana versus all y'all. Thanks, y'all, for tuning in. And until next time, y'all be well.